All right, we're going to be going back through the Daily Bible for January 11th, 2025. And it's a pretty interesting one today. We've been talking about Abraham's story for a while now, and it's been this buildup for when is his son finally going to come. And in Genesis 21, Isaac finally arrives. And then Genesis 22, he almost gets sacrificed. So that's quite a story. Then we have the Psalm. I forget what the Psalm is today, but the proverb is two verses that are two of the four of my favorite verses in all of Proverbs. And then in Matthew, it's Matthew 8, which is, I didn't realize what a good chapter Matthew 8 is, but it's got one of the best stories in the entire Bible, which is when Jesus calms the storm. So a lot to dive into today. So we'll just start off in Genesis 21. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. So previously, God had promised that Abraham was not only going to have a son and be the father of many nations. That's why he changed his name to Abraham, father of many nations, instead of just Abram, which was exalted father. And he does have Ishmael, which is his son through Hagar, which is Sarah's servant. That was sort of a plan they hatched because they maybe didn't fully trust that God was going to fulfill his promise on his own. Maybe they wanted to take things into their own hands and control the situation a bit. So Ishmael is not the son of Abraham and Sarah. Isaac is the son. And there is one point where God was always kind of vague with his promises to Abraham, saying you'll be the descendant, you'll have many descendants, you'll be the father of many nations, but didn't give too many details. And then there was one point where God comes to him and just flat out says, you're not only going to be the father of many nations, but it's going to be through Sarah that this happens. You'll have a son with her, and she'll actually be, you'll have that son by this time next year. And I don't know if it's I think it was you'll have the son by this time next year, not even just be pregnant. So God gives him the exact details. And the story's been building up basically to this moment, as the Lord had promised. The takeaway there is probably what the Lord promises, he comes through on. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him Isaac. Isaac means he laughs. And the reason for that is because when God first told Abraham that he was going to have a son through Sarah, he was 99 years old and Sarah was 90. So Abraham first laughs when he hears it. And then Sarah overhears it in the tent, and then she laughs. And this is, I think, one of the better stories in the Bible where they're all good. But this one has like a funny line in it where God asks Abraham, he goes, hey, why did Sarah just laugh when I said that she's going to bear a son? And then Sarah hears this and becomes kind of afraid. And she says, oh, I didn't laugh. And then God just shuts it down. He goes, no, but you did laugh. And then the story just kind of like pivots right after that. It's pretty good. So that's why they named Isaac. He laughs. And then, so Isaac's born. We've been waiting for that. And then there's kind of a little side story here between Hagar and Ishmael, where maybe Sarah's not so happy that Ishmael's still around, so she wants him cast out. And then God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your, he says, slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you, for through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also, because he is your offspring. So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness to Beersheba. So kind of a rough go of things for Hagar and Ishmael. And it seems that God kind of okayed this. So at first reading, you might think, man, we're supposed to believe God is compassionate. And he's basically telling Abraham, if we're looking at this through a viewing God with bad intentions, it kind of seems like he's telling Abraham, you know what? Your descendants, like the main ones, are going to be through Sarah and through Isaac. So we're going to focus on that. You know, that slave woman that you had a kid with? Well, yeah, let's just kind of brush that aside. We'll send her and Ishmael off into the wilderness, and you focus on your core family right here. So that's maybe what people would think of when they first read this. And it seems like God's basically just saying, enough with Hagar and Ishmael, like they're done. Although he does still promise here that I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also. So he's not completely saying, oh, they're done. Although it does kind of seem that way as they start to wander in the wilderness. And then things actually get a little bit worse before they get better. And I think that's the key thing that we're supposed to pull out of the story. So when the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot. For she said, let me not look on the death of my child. So they're both about to basically die of thirst in the wilderness. And she sat opposite him, and she lifted up her voice and wept. So you can imagine her in this moment. She's just alone in the wilderness. Her son is about to die. She probably feels just abandoned by everyone. She has no idea what to do. So she just throws up her hand and just cries. She lifts up her voice and cries. And God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. So there's that promise again, and telling her to lift Ishmael up. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. So at first you're thinking, oh, God's just abandoning them. He has no compassion. He's just throwing them off into the wilderness. But sometimes things have to get worse before they get better. And it's interesting that it's in Hagar's absolute lowest moment that she gets to that point where she just cries up to God. It doesn't actually say cries up to God, but we get that kind of gist that she's given up at this point. And it's in that moment that she's ready to be humbly submitted to God. And what's great is God doesn't say, you didn't submit to me early enough, so, you learned your lesson, but it's too late for you. No, he comes in and he says, I'm right here. I've actually been here the entire time. I've been guiding you back to me throughout your hardest times. This was the hardest. This is your low point. But that's where you had to get before you were ready for me. And I think a lot of people can probably relate to that. And then I also like this imagery of the well. So then God opened her eyes. First off, that God opened her eyes. I wonder if that's just talking about, let's see, this is verse 19. Let's see if this study Bible has anything on that. No, it doesn't. But that open her eyes, I wonder if that's almost talking about the Holy Spirit comes into her. And when that happens, you almost immediately view the world through a completely different lens. And it is also interesting that it doesn't say she cries to God. It just says she lifted up her voice and wept. So perhaps it's God at this moment opens her eyes and just kind of brings the Spirit into her. So it's actually kind of a beautiful moment that just happened here. And she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And then God was with the boy, and he grew up. So the reason I like that well imagery is before, I might be reading into this a little bit too much, but before you come to Christ, you're looking for all sorts of things to fill yourself up with, but nothing ultimately fills you up. The more you sip, the thirstier you get, sometimes literally. And Jesus consistently talks about God as like a well or a spring. I believe it's there's a story where he's talking to, maybe it's the Samaritan woman, and he says, anyone who drinks of this well will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the well that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will well up in him and become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. Definitely a paraphrase right there. I gotta look at that verse again. But it's the idea that as long as we're trying to fill ourselves up, we're going to die of thirst. But when we turn to God, or more, maybe the better way to say it is when God opens our eyes and we are filled with the Holy Spirit and that regeneration happens, and then we start to build that relationship with God and actually want to, then he just starts welling up within us and we're no longer dying of thirst. That water can actually pour out of us onto others. So may have read more into that story than I was supposed to, but I don't know. There seems to be a lot of beautiful imagery there. And then there's a treaty with Abimelech. Going to kind of skip over that part because I didn't really have time to look into it too much. I just read it. But I do want to show the last part of it. So Abraham planted a tamarisk tree in Beersheba and called there on the name of the Lord, the everlasting God. And Abraham sojourned many days in the lands of the Philistines. So in the first story with Abraham where he goes to Egypt, it doesn't say he's calling on God. And it seems to be where we're kind of viewing Abraham not in a good way. And then there's the story where God, through Abraham, rescues Lot from like the 4 armies that had captured him and Sodom and the other king and the kings of the 5 nations. And it was in that story where Abraham's viewed in a much better light. He's offered wealth and he turns it down. He saves all these people. He brings back their possessions. A high priest, I think his name is Melchizedek, like blesses him. And it's in that chapter where it makes the point of saying like Abraham made an altar to God. He called upon the name of the Lord. And this one ends with him calling on the name of the Lord again. He called on the name, the everlasting God. So we're getting the idea that Abraham's at this point starting to walk with God again. It seems like he's up and down throughout his journey and how much he's obedient to God and acting well. But after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here I am. So before we even read further that God tested Abraham, it almost reminds me a little bit of that story of Hagar and Ishmael, where maybe she's sent into the wilderness to be tested by God. But it reminds me even more of when Jesus is sent into the wilderness to be tested by Satan. So God does allow us to be tested. He allows trials to come on us because it's an opportunity for us to either have faith that God's going to get us through it, or it's an opportunity for us to, almost like Hagar, just be humbly submit and say, I can't do it. God, I need your help in this moment. Or it's an opportunity to be completely obedient. Maybe he does just want us to go through some pretty hard thing and just be willing to take it instead of trying to kind of weasel our way out of it. So let's see what God has planned for Abraham to test him and see if Abraham goes through with it. So he says, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains on which I shall tell you. So keep in mind, Abraham waited 100 years for this son. Finally came. There's so much joy. Like at one point, and Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So much joy that the son is finally here. And now God is saying, burnt offering. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. So no hesitation there. Maybe this is because previously it said called upon the name of the Lord. Seems like Abraham is once again obedient to God. Certainly seems that way. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." So he says that I and the boy are going to go over there and we're going to worship. And it's interesting that it says, I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. So there's no indication that he's saying that I'm the only one who's going to be coming back. Seems like it's the I and the boy are in these three different things that they're doing. Going over there, worshiping, coming again to you. So although he's going over there to sacrifice his son, he seems to still have faith that God's going to maybe, I don't know what he's thinking, but it seems that he believes that Isaac is going to be coming back with him. And maybe that's because he is finally believing that God's promise that he'll have many descendants and be the father of many nations, and he knows, hey, Isaac's my only son. God promised me all these descendants. Something's going to happen here before the heir, or not the heir, but the way that those descendants will come about is sacrificed. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father. Said to his father Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold, the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. So Abraham says right here, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. If that's not a point towards Jesus, I don't know what is. God providing for himself the lamb for a burnt offering. But it seems like Abraham still has faith that God's going to provide a lamb. It seems like he's saying will provide a lamb. That seems like future tense, as opposed to has provided a lamb. Would be maybe if he's referring to Isaac as a lamb, because Isaac's already here. So the fact that it's future tense, will provide for himself the lamb, seems that Abraham still believes God's going to kind of change this somehow. But he's also not holding back. He's getting the wood together. He's got the fire. He's got the knife. And he's saying, I'm obedient. I'm going to go through with it. Let's see what happens. So they both went out of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. No hesitation. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. So at this point, he's going for it. He's fully obedient. He's ready to sacrifice the son that him and Sarah waited their entire lives for. And we're so joyful to have. But there's always, whenever you see but when something bad's about to happen in the Bible, it usually proceeds to say like, but God or but the Lord, and then God steps in and sort of saves the day. You might say, well, this is only happening because God put them in this position in the first place. But remember, this is a test for Abraham. So, but the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. So it was a test to see if he truly fears God. Does he fear losing his son more, or does he fear being disobedient to God more? That's about as ultimate a test as you could possibly have. Seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. So that is a story of, God's provision. And ultimately, God did provide the lamb, which was Jesus Christ. Because instead of us having to bear the consequences of our disobedience, God basically did the job for us by sending his son to pay off our debts. That maybe wasn't the exact kind of conclusion to what that story was telling us, but I think the conclusion of that story is be obedient to God. God's looking out for you, and God will provide. And he has already provided. So now let's get into the psalm. Probably not going to read the whole one today, just maybe Psalm 6, verse 9 was my favorite part of it. The Lord has heard my supplication. The Lord will receive my prayer. So it reminds me of Hagar when she's in the wilderness. It doesn't actually say she's crying out to God, just says she was crying out. But it's sort of the same idea there, that when you get in that position where maybe you've gone through some struggle, maybe you've gone through some hard times, but perhaps that was what was necessary to maybe weigh down or to burn off some of your pride, maybe burn off some of that part of you that was trying to do everything on your own, that was trying to control the situation too much, which is not a healthy way to live. And you just had to go through that struggle to get to the point where you're ready to throw up your hands and cry out to God. And notice the verse, the Lord will receive my prayer. And we should always have confidence in that. Now, Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths. I believe that ESV version of this is, trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. So let's go through that. So trust in the Lord with all your heart. That is pretty self-explanatory, to just trust in the Lord with all of your heart. It's key that it's coming from the heart, because that seems to be a consistent thing that Jesus is always talking about, that it's the most important thing. Where your heart is, like, that's what you'll be devoted to. So if in your heart you truly trust God, then that's just going to end up influencing your thoughts, your feelings, and your actions as well. That's kind of the core. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and do not lean on your own understanding. So this basically summarized my journey. I went through some hard times, you could say freshman year of college, and then spent a decade trying to lean on my own understanding, going to different philosophers and different people and trying to adopt their ideas into my life, see what works, keep what works, and then throw the rest out, find some new philosopher, adopt their ideas, see what works, throw the rest out. And I've tried this over and over and over again, thinking that it would bring me perfection is probably the best way to say it. I was trying to eliminate all my bad habits. And I think I thought that would bring me peace, because I'd get to the point where I was maximizing my potential. And what I maybe feared more than anything was wasting my potential. But the problem was I couldn't maximize my potential because I was still fallen. I was still in that state where I was living like a descendant of Adam, where as hard as I tried, as many personal development books as I read, as much as I learned from all of these different philosophers, and I created strategies and frameworks for how I was going to have the perfect routine and accomplish my goals, a lot of times it did actually lead to me accomplishing my goals, but it wasn't actually solving that inner problem, which was that lack of peace and that fear of lost potential. And also just using fear as motivation. And as long as I was leaning on my own understanding, I might have been getting better externally, but internally I was actually getting more and more exhausted, and I was wearing myself thin. I basically got to the point like Hagar in the wilderness, where I threw up my hands and said, I can't do this on my own. So easy for me to understand a verse like this, that do not lean on your own understanding, because I tried to lean on my understanding for a decade, and I did intense study and intense application, intense experimentation basically on myself. And the conclusion I came to is I can't do it on my own understanding. I literally tried everything I could think of, and I tried it as hard as I possibly could, and it didn't work. And what does work is trusting in the Lord. That's the opposite. And I'm not perfect. There are still days where I try to control things and I try to manage situations and lean on my own understanding. But this verse is a great reminder not to do that. And then it goes on to say, in all your ways, acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. So in all your ways, acknowledge him. That means whatever you're doing, acknowledge God, bring God into it. Like, let's say you're a teacher and you're about to teach a lesson. Don't just think, okay, I'm going to strategize how to make this lesson perfect, and then this is how it's going to go, and I'm going to control the classroom. You want to acknowledge God, have God come through this moment, come through you into the classroom, and say, like, pray to God, say, God, speak through me, guide this class, give me words that will, I don't know, you get the idea. That's just one example, but you can imagine how you could do that in all sorts of different examples. So in all your ways, acknowledge him, no matter what you're doing, bring God into it, and have God maybe working through you in whatever you're doing. And then it says, and he will make straight your paths. So what leads to that windy road of lots of mistakes, as we've seen with Abraham? Seems like Abraham's road has not been straight. And it seems like it's not straight when he's no longer calling upon the name of the Lord. That seems to be the pattern that's happened, where he goes off the road when he's not calling on the name of the Lord. But when he's calling on the name of the Lord, it seems like that path is a bit straighter. So if you acknowledge God in everything you do, that path will be straighter. And then tomorrow's Proverbs going to be a great one as well. But without further ado, let's get into Matthew 8, because this has some pretty interesting stories, and they're short, concise. I love how just densely packed a lot of the lessons and teachings are in Matthew. So the cost of following Jesus, this is verse 18 in chapter 8. Now when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side, and a scribe came up and said to him, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. So Jesus has done the Sermon on the Mount. He's been healing lots of people. He's maybe ready to get some alone time at this point. And a scribe of all people comes up to him and says, Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go. The reason I say scribe of all people is it's usually the Pharisees and the scribes who are, almost all of them are just completely against Jesus. And something kind of interesting about that I learned throughout the day today, it relates to the structure of scientific revolutions. Let's see if I can explain this. How it works is there's a foundation of, you could say, knowledge, and then people build upon that foundation. We'll just talk about science right now. So there's foundation, and then people build along that foundation, and you end up with the leaders of the field up here. But every once in a while, a heretic comes along, and I don't know if heretic is the word I should be using here, but he points to some part that's close to the foundation, and he says, that's wrong, or he says, that's not entirely true. And usually at this point, the leaders of the field will start attacking that person, because if the foundation's not true, then a lot of that work that they did is basically irrelevant, or that tower kind of collapses until maybe a new one builds up on a different foundation. Now, the other reason they attack is most of the time the people calling out the foundation are wrong, because they're basically going against everybody else. And it's more likely that everybody else is right and this person is wrong. But every once in a while, this person's right and everybody else is wrong, because this person's seeing something that nobody else sees. So this is how scientific revolutions happen, where eventually they say science moves forward one funeral at a time. It's kind of the egos of the people at the top that suppress the truth that this person is saying because it is against their interests. But then as they kind of die off, new scientists coming up will start to maybe read that person's work in secret, and they start to see, you know what, he's actually got some points there, and they start to build off of that a little bit, and it starts to build a new foundation. Now in this, it usually doesn't wipe out the entire foundation. It maybe just changes some of the nodes in there, and then it just expands our knowledge over time. And that's similar to what Jesus did, where he didn't say he's here to destroy the law, but he's here to fulfill it, and he's here to add to it. And that's often how it works. It's not that Einstein came along and said everything Newton did is worthless. He says, you know, a lot of what Newton did is very helpful and works for almost every situation that we're going to need it for. But here's relativity. And this is an entire new field that we can go off into. So the reason I brought that up is the scribe would have been part of that group more up here, that when Jesus is coming in and is challenging, or it would seem that he's challenging the foundation that they're standing upon, they attack him. But what Jesus is really doing is not demolishing the law, but fulfilling it. And they maybe just don't get that yet. But it seems like this scribe might get it. And he says he wants to follow him wherever he goes. And Jesus has kind of a cryptic reply to this. It's kind of like a riddle. And Jesus said to him, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. That's interesting. Basically, what he's saying is, you don't know what you're getting yourself into. Like, you think it might be easy to follow me, but I'm the Son of Man. And some people view that where it's the most common way that Jesus refers to himself. It's the third most common way that Jesus is referred to in the New Testament. First one is Christ, which means Messiah and anointed one. Second one is Lord. Third is Son of Man. But it's the most common one that Jesus refers to himself as. I think he refers to himself maybe 83 times as the Son of Man. Don't quote me on that. But when you first hear it, you think, oh, Jesus is being humble. He doesn't want to say, I'm the Son of God, because that would seem too kind of calling yourself God. He's saying Son of Man to emphasize that he is truly God, but he is truly man as well. So that's the obvious interpretation. But as I was reading through some commentaries on the study Bible, when Son of Man is used, I believe in Daniel, it's used in a way that is showing the glory of God and that God has authority. So when Jesus is using that, he's pointing back to that, and it's actually referring to his godliness as opposed to his manliness, if that's a decent way to say it. So Son of Man, a little more complicated than it seems. I still am not totally confident I understand it fully, but there's more to that Son of Man than I first thought. But what he's saying is he's calling back to that God authority, basically, idea that he's exalted. But then he's saying has nowhere to lay his head. So the idea here is that he is God. He is like he created the universe, but he had the humility to bring himself down, become man, and he doesn't even have a place to lay his head. So what he's calling to and pointing towards is the humility and even the humiliation that he is willing to take on in order to fulfill the prophecies and basically fulfill his ministry and save us all from our sins. So he's saying, you might think this is going to be an easy walk, but if I'm, as God, willing to go to the lowest of the low, I'm going to call you to that kind of humility as well. And it's not going to be easy. Another of the disciples said to him, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. And Jesus said to him, Follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead. So right there, one of the disciples asked to bury his father, which apparently at this time was a very big deal for the oldest son. If the father died, he could drop his religious duties. He could drop whatever he was doing to make sure the father had a proper burial. And Jesus is saying, throw away that tradition because I'm calling you to something much greater. And you're going to need to sacrifice things that you think are important in order to help me. And when I say follow me, there's nothing else that you should even consider. Like, that's it. That's what you are being called to do. And you should be willing to just drop everything else in order to do that as well as you possibly can. There's no, oh, can I do this real quick? Can I do that? Oh, but maybe I do these things on the side. And this, he's saying, no, you're being called. I'm calling you to follow me. And that's what's going to happen. So, again, kind of in both these cases, it seems a little harsh. But I actually like it when it's like this, that Jesus isn't just only this nice guy that maybe we want to think that he is, but he's calling his followers to a difficult life. Difficult is the way which leads to life. Then this next one is another one where, he maybe rebukes a little bit. So as Jesus calms the storm, and this is one of the best stories in the entire Bible. And when he got into the boat, so he wants to go across the sea to get away from the big crowd. When he got into the boat, his disciples followed him. And behold, there arose a great storm on the sea, so that the boat was being swamped by the waves, but he was asleep. So they're going across the sea, huge storm, and Jesus is just sleeping in the back. And he was asleep. Sorry, I lost my spot there. Getting a wee bit tired. And they went and woke him, saying, Save us, Lord, we are perishing. And he said to them, Why are you afraid, O you of little faith? So that's where I say he rebukes them a little bit. They're panicking, they're fearful. Some of them have been on the sea their entire lives. They're experienced fishermen, probably have been in storms before, but this one, they are panicking. They think they're going to die. And their response is, Why are you afraid, O you of little faith? And what R.C. Sproul was saying in his commentary on this is one of the things a lot of atheists have pointed to as why are so many people religious? Like, why do so many people believe in God? And I believe it was what Freud said, was that humans can negotiate with other humans in order to reduce our fear of them. We can kind of trade with them, or we can manipulate them, or we can have empathy and ask that to go both ways. And there's things we can do to minimize the threat of other humans. But when it comes to nature, it can seem like it's completely out of our control. Something like a hurricane or a tornado or a wildfire or an earthquake. So in order for humans to be able to cope with this harsh environment that we're living in, a lot of the atheists say that God was invented so that we would, and in a personal manner, so that we would think that we could do that same sort of bartering to reduce threat that we have with other human beings. You could ask the, thunder god to not make a tornado. You could ask the, earth god or whatever not to make an earthquake, or whoever the hurricane god is. I don't know. Or in case of Christianity, the God of everything, we could communicate him to subdue the scary nature around us and to make us, he says it's like the opiate of the masses, to reduce that fear that we have. But what R.C. Sproul points out is that the main thing that they're missing is that our fear of the Lord, as you go further and further into Christianity and deeper into the Bible, your fear of the Lord grows, and your fear of the Lord actually becomes greater than any other fear that you had, whether it's the fear of hurricanes or tornadoes or wildfires. So it'd be weird if we invent something to get rid of our fears, and then on the way that we invent something to get rid of those fears is by creating something that's even scarier. So that doesn't really make sense. It also doesn't make sense if you view it as like the opiate of the masses. Basically, oh, we're just trying to put blinders on so that we're not struggling or suffering too much. If we make up this story that there's meaning, then we'll be able to deal with everything, and it's going to make things easier. But as we've just seen, and Jesus talking about Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head, follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead. He's not calling us to some easy life. He's not calling us to comfort. He's definitely not calling us to comfort. He's calling us to a harder life. So that idea that it's the opiate of the masses is completely missing the point. If anything, most of the people, or all the people who aren't following Christ, are the ones engaged in that opiate of the masses. They just have lots of different forms of opiate, whether it's entertainment or alcohol or drugs or food, you name it. There are all these things that people do and they consume, and they watch to try to deal with the suffering of reality, to turn their brains off so that they don't have to think about what's going on around them. It's through Christ that we actually deal with reality head on. And we say, let's go through this, bring on the challenge. And I can say that because it's not going to be me just going through this. I know that God is going to bring me through this, and God's going to be with me the entire time. And it's going to be hard, it's going to be difficult, but that's going to be how God builds me up, strengthens me, and gives me an opportunity to rely on him more. If I'm comfortable, I'm going to be less likely to ask God for help, to turn to God for help, to trust in God with all my heart. It's in the challenges where we're brought low like Hagar in the wilderness, and we are more likely to call to God for help. So take that, atheist. And I say that as someone who was literally didn't believe in God until a little over a year ago. So there's hope. So he says, they say, save us, Lord, we are perishing. And he says to them, why are you afraid, O you of little faith? So the reason I went on that tangent there is they're afraid of the storm, and then they turn to God. So that's kind of what Karl Marx would probably read that and point out and say, oh, this is a perfect example of what's going on here. They're afraid of the storm, so then they turn to God. But he would put like quotes around God. Then he rose and rebuked the winds and the sea, and there was a great calm. And the men marveled, saying, what sort of man is this, that even winds and sea obey him? So Jesus stands up, he tells the winds and the sea, be calm, and immediately it's calm, a great calm. It's absolutely still. And the men marveled, saying, what sort of man is this, that even the winds and sea obey him? So in Matthew, he used the words marvel. He uses the word marveled for how the apostles respond to this. And marveled, you could view that as like wonder or awe, or maybe there's a little bit of that idea of the fear of the Lord in there. I think it's Luke who literally just says they're afraid when this happens. They're more afraid of Jesus than they were of the storm. So that's where someone like a Karl Marx doesn't read into it enough. He might read the first part and say, oh, there's a huge storm, they're afraid, and then they believe in Jesus, and then it calms the storm. What a perfect picture of how we turn to we invent some God to help us deal with reality. But what he wouldn't look into is the end of the story where they see what Jesus is capable of. They see that he is in a class of his own, that there is no box that they can put him into because he's different than anything that they've ever seen in their entire lives. They see the absolute power and authority that he has, and they are crushed and they're brought to their knees and they're made humble. And it's hard to explain to anyone who's never felt that before, but that's similar to the feeling I had when I received the Holy Spirit. And it was only for a flash of a second where I got a brief glimpse of what God was like, and it just crushed me. So I could not imagine I can't imagine what it's going to be like when we see God face to face. It is going to be quite overwhelming, but it's going to be good. So there is another story about Jesus healing two people who have demons. He sends the demons into a herd of swine, and then the swine run down the hill, drown themselves, and then the people of the city don't really like it. All the people of the city came out to meet Jesus, and when they saw him, they begged him to leave their region. So going along with the idea that they might be just mad that maybe 2,000 of the pigs just died, and that might be a blow to their economy. But they also might see the extreme power that he has, and they're just afraid of him. And they want him to just leave. They can't handle it. So that seems to be a theme of tonight. Sort of a new idea that I haven't really thought about too much before, but I'm going to start thinking about it more because I think fear of the Lord is probably one of my weak points, but maybe something I should focus more on, as it seems like that is important. Having him up here, us in a humble position. And as my pastor said, when we first come to God, we might be around this level. And then as you learn more and more about God, you realize how high he is and then how low you are. And that just continues as you go throughout your Christian walk. So definitely some good stories today. Interested to see what we'll be learning about tomorrow.